So this is going to be kind of a self-indulgent video. It's a little bit of a trip down memory lane, but I think there is a point to it of sorts, because my memory lane is a lot more twisty and turny than the straight line path toward a goal that we see in the horse world these days. When I was growing up, specialization really wasn't a thing, and a lot of disciplines were in their relative infancy in the sense that they hadn't gotten as sophisticated. So it was easier to try new things. And early on in my career with horses, or my experience with horses, without consciously thinking this through as a goal, I wanted to do every damn thing you could do with horses. And I virtually did try everything out, and at that time the entry bar was sufficiently low that I could go in, get in a competition, feel competitive and comfortable, not like I'm a fish out of water, and have that experience of another facet of the horse world. So I'm doing something you may never have seen me do in any of the other videos. I've got a few notes because I want to make sure I don't leave stuff out, and I just want to walk through all of the different shit that I've done with horses over the last half century or more. Like everybody else in the 1960s that was under the age of 10, I started out with ponies, Shetland ponies, carnivorous little buggers. You could learn a lot from them if you lived, and I did. And I had 2 ponies that came in, they weren't broke. My dad got them and said, well, they're little. What can they do wrong? Get them started. And I got at him, and after a bit, it turned out he was right. I rode those ponies everywhere. One of them was my sister's. I got that one broke. Mine was a little younger. Then he got broke. And then everybody in the neighborhood came over and rode those ponies. And I started getting ponies from other people. When I was all of 10 or 11 years old, I'd have 2 or 3 ponies out in the pasture that I was riding for other people. So we had a whole string of them. And we went everywhere on these things. We swam them in the pond, and we went and stood on their backs and picked apples out of the old apple orchard we had on the place. And we rode them through the woods and the creeks, and we tried to play broomstick polo on them, and you name it, we did it. Eventually, that transitioned into horses, and I started getting interested in the various different things you could do with horses. But first and foremost, we like to cover country on horses. I still do. Still love to go outside. And throughout even my show horses, I'd be out trail riding horses with slide plates on, because I like to get outside. I like to get my horses outside, cover some country, see some things. Well, my dad was a physician, a responsible person, and the ultimate risk taker. He was extremely risk tolerant. He had a knack for doing dangerous things in a safe way, good survival skills, also good reflexes, and pretty good luck. So when we went trail riding, we would go places that were a little bit hard to imagine. A 10-year-old kid on a pony without a saddle, or later on a kid on a $90 horse with the tops of his ears frozen off, trying to go along and get through some of the places we went. And my dad had a real simple rule. If you can walk there without having to touch down and use your hands to crawl, then the horse ought to be able to go. Well, there were more than a few places we went where I think I'd have been on my hands and knees, but it made you more secure. You learned when to trust your horse, when to help your horse. And just that kind of survivalist training, kind of puts you in shape to get on to the next area of your horse career. My dad had also shown open jumpers at a pretty high level. And though he had had a bad injury in his 20s and had sworn off upper level competition and actually told my mother he was not going to jump anymore, over the course of a weekend, a jump course miraculously materialized in this big front field that wrapped around our house and around the side of our house, then probably linear-wise was a little bit better than a quarter of a mile, maybe pushing a half a mile. And he had log jumps, and he had rail jumps, and he'd go out in the woods and cut down, 6-inch oak standing dead trees, trim off the branches and make rails out of them. Talk about solid, they were solid. And so me, aged about 12, and my sister, aged about 8, were invited to accompany him as he began to work his way through this course. And my mother said to him, now, you said you were going to stop jumping. And he had a way of sort of brushing things off. He said, oh, Gene, it's not jumping till it's at least 4 feet. And somehow she accepted that. So in no time at all, we were jumping 3 foot, 3'6" on these horses that were not jumping horses, but by God, they got to where they jumped what you pointed them at. And we had a ball with it. Pretty irresponsible. I'm not sure I was wearing a helmet. Got through it all, and I will say this. Everybody at some point in their life should ride for a period of time bareback and should get some instruction and have some experience riding English. It will build your balance. And that whole experience did that for me. So we had that jumping phase. I took some English riding lessons, but the cowboy thing was pulling at me. This is the 60s. It's a time when people all dreamed of being cowboys, and I sort of wanted that Western saddle and the cowboy hat and all of that stuff. So time came, there was a pretty good sized horse show in town at the fairgrounds. My dad said, we're going to take my horse, his horse, in, and you are going to show it. Well, this was way more horse than I'd really ever ridden, and I typically wasn't allowed to ride him. But my dad said, well, he's the only one we have I can see being a show horse. So you take him in there and, we'll show him. Well, I still remember the prize list for that show. It was a big show, but things in the Western side were in their infancy, and they had what they called a children's pleasure class. And it said specifically, leads not to count. Well, it was just as well they didn't, because I couldn't have told you which lead I was on. And I really felt in over my head and came home from that show not much wanting to go to another one until I had kind of learned a little more. So over the next couple of years, I did not go to a show, but I had another little horse that I worked on steadily, and about 2 years later, asked my dad if we could go to a horse show. He said, sure. Went to a show near home, not a real big show, but not small, and came out reserve champion performance horse for the day. Because I had absorbed all those things, and I had some lessons. English lessons as things worked out, but you learned the right stuff. And I knew what leads were now, and I knew, what I needed to do to get the horse shown. And from there, like a lot of kids did, I got into 4-H. I showed in the 4-H classes. I started doing some of the speed events. Again, people tend to say, well, we don't believe in doing that. It's all jerking and spurring and running. I don't know that I ever walked into the show pen on any of my running horses with a pair of spurs or a whip. And I wear spurs all the time these days, but the horses I had then were willing to go. And I thought having that kind of equipment on them didn't add much. And I had a pretty good little career for a number of years showing barrel horses, pole horses, and every different thing you could do, from the pickup race to the sort of fun junk classes like egg and spoon and dollar bareback, all of that stuff. If you went to a horse show and there were 20 classes, I was in 19 of them. And you got all of that background. Instead of doing what we do today, saying, well, what discipline are you interested in, Sonny? You want to jump? Okay, well, we'll work you up to where you can jump over, 1.5 feet in 2 years. You'll enjoy that. and that's what we're going to do. Or, oh, you want to ride reining horses? Yeah, there's a reining barn, an hour away. We'll haul you down there. We'll get you a reiner, and you can give that a try, and that's all you do. These horses were not doing it on the level they do today, God knows. But they were doing it. We were getting to experience it. So you got all of this stuff coming together. In the 4-H club, I was on the 4-H horse judging team. We ended up winning the state and placing second, I think, at the Northeast Regional Contest. And from there, before I had a driver's license, I and the two other guys who had been on the judging team started getting asked to judge shows. We'd go and judge them as a team. And it was kind of fun. And I remember the first show that I judged, it was 3 of us went, we split up the classes, and at the end of the day, they passed the hat. And my take was $9 for that day of horse show judging, and I thought I had arrived. And in fact, by the time I was in my early 20s, I was judging between 20 and 30 shows a year, which was a nice little increase to my revenue, considering that you made a lot more money judging a show than working odd jobs. So my horse show judging career was upside down. I judged shows through my late teens, my 20s, my 30s, and by the time I was 40, I said, this was fun, I'm stepping away, I want to show my own horses. And I occasionally have judged a show since then, but rarely. But still, that comparative experience, learning how to evaluate a horse, learning in the 4-H program at that time how to give reasons for what you did and why on a comparative basis with a class of 4 horses, comparing one to the next, to the next, to the next, was hugely useful in teaching me how to evaluate a horse in a rational, organized fashion. So, somewhere along the way, between the horse shows and this and that, I was showing pleasure horses, I was showing barrel horses. And typically, I'd take 2 horses to the show. 1 horse I would run, and I'd show back in the reining. The other horse I would ride in the Western Pleasure and the Western Equitation, and I'd show back in the reining because they could sort of cross over at that time. But my dad got interested in competitive trail riding. And so, okay, I'll get into that. I can remember a real lesson at the first competitive ride I went to. My dad had a horse. A friend of ours named Chuck Wiley had a horse, and I had a horse. Chuck's horse was a pure Arab. My dad's was half Arab, and so was mine. And even at that early stage, it was clear the Arabs were going to excel. We were really pretty locked and loaded and ready to go, but the trail was not marked real well, and we got lost. And that happened to a lot of people. And they had some bad incidents at that ride. People got behind on time. They pushed their horses too hard. And actually at that ride, which was a big ride, there was well over 100 horses, 2 horses died. But the judge, or one of the judges that day, was a very famous veterinarian who was also himself a very high-level endurance rider named Matthew McKay Smith. He had the distinction of winning the Tevis Cup, which is the Western States 100-mile and 1-day ride that is considered kind of state-of-the-art even today, and the Old Dominion ride in Virginia, another 100-miler that at that time were considered to be the 2 toughest in the country. He won both those races in the same year with the same horse. A hell of a horseman, very well-regarded vet, ended up being the veterinary editor for Equus magazine when that was really a source, and just an impressive individual. And they were given the awards out, and they asked him to say a few words, and I thought, we're going to hear something about the people who won. And he said, well, I'm going to call out 3 people. He said, this gentleman here, he pointed to my dad, his friend, and his son. He said, they did the right thing. Like a lot of people, they got lost. And unlike a lot of other people, they brought in their horses in good condition. And they worried more about bringing their horses in good shape than trying to beat the clock and ruining their horse. He said that deserves more credit than winning the ride, because it's horsemanship. And I never had anybody single me out for something like that. And we hadn't questioned what we did, but we did avoid pounding our horses. We just took the time penalties and ended up placing way deep in the pack. But we did bring in horses that were in good shape. And that was a lesson that resonated with me, especially coming from that kind of source. So, that was just one of those moments that, advances the ball for you in terms of your thinking. As things went forward, I went off to college. When I'm in college, I'm an English major, but also went to horseshoeing school. I was the world's worst horseshoer. But I learned enough about it that I could shoe a horse if I had to. I could tack a shoe back on. I could pull a shoe. I could trim a hoof. And more importantly, I could recognize good work when I saw it. What I also recognized was I was never going to be the guy who did that good job. I could never have pleased myself. But that was a real worthwhile experience. And as always, I'm going to interject a story or two, as I've already done. At the horseshoeing school, it was at Penn State, taught by just a great horseman named Ward Studebaker. And Ward was a master horseshoer and a really good hand with a horse. And he said, the first thing you need to learn to do is to heat up a piece of bar stock and just make a perfect right angle turn. And don't kink the metal, don't make a loop, make a perfect right angle turn on your anvil. If you can do that, you're on the way to hand making shoes. Because what they had you do was hand make your shoes for a while, and then shaping a shoe that was ready-made began to seem pretty easy. So he says, I'm just going to go get a cup of coffee. When I come back, we'll see how you guys are doing. Well, everybody's pounding away, and I had to get a second piece of bar stock because I damaged mine so badly. And there's one guy over there, he says, bang, 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 bang. And so Ward comes back and he's walking through. You got a pretty good angle here. You did okay there. He goes to this fella, Mark Smith, and Mark had, a perfect right angle. But then just as a little fringe benefit, he had hammered out a knife, a fork, and a spoon and had them lying there for Ward's approval. And Ward Studebaker looks at him, he says, who in the hell are you? Turns out Mark was the resident blacksmith at a theme park in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where they had like a heritage center where various crafts were demonstrated. And he had his blacksmith shop there and did demonstrations and was a really good metal worker. But he told me he had gotten tired of people asking if he knew how to shoe a horse, and he had to say, no, I don't. And they said, well, what kind of blacksmith are you? Problem was, he had virtually never handled a horse before. So I took my lack of skill doing ironwork and his lack of skill with horses, and we worked together the whole week, 2 weeks actually. And it was a wonderful collaboration because I learned as much from him as I did from the instructors because he was so good, and I managed to keep him from getting killed. But I can still see that knife, fork, and spoon, and I bet Ward Studebaker kept them. And they weren't bad, knocked out in about 15 minutes. So you never know who you're dealing with, do you? After college, started training horses for other people, which I've been doing a bit all along. And the cool thing at that time was you got every kind of horse you could imagine. It wasn't, oh, well, I'm going to do all 2-year-olds. No, you got whatever came through the door. I'm going to train all quarter horses, or I really want to just train reiners. No, if you wanted to make enough money to sort of keep going, there wasn't that specialization available to you if you wanted it. So my barn was like the United Nations. There'd be an Arab here and a a half draft there and a Morgan over here and a couple of quarter horses and an off-the-track thoroughbred and God knows what else. And it gave me the opportunity to experience all these other breeds, all these various breeds, various temperaments, which people don't necessarily get these days. It was, while on the one hand, I wasn't laser focused on a goal, I was still accomplishing my goal of trying to do everything I could with horses and with every kind of horse you could do it with. And that was really satisfying. You didn't necessarily get the same kind of progress, but you realized that there were more similarities to horses than there are differences. That you could take a horse that had limited talent and still make him functional. And while it might have been much more rewarding to work with really well-bred, athletic, trainable horses, I got more than my share of problem horses, and it sort of built in some useful skills that came up from time to time when I'd have a horse that was a little tough. I spent 6 months in Australia training horses out back, starting 4 and 5 year old colts that had never been handled. Got some help figuring out how to do it, and then got a bunch of them to turn out. That was an experience you don't get in the eastern United States. And it was kind of like doing the Mustang makeover every day. And it really gave me some skills that somebody'd say, hey, I've just bought a 4-year-old, but he's never been handled. Who could deal with that? Can you? I'd say, yeah, I probably can. That was a good experience as well. So all of this different stuff. Eventually, I got very interested in reining horses. My belief was, and I still believe this, and if you have a horse basically trained to do the reining maneuvers, to be handy, to turn around, to change leads, to change speeds, to guide perfectly, to stop immediately, while it might not even reach show level on some horses, you will have a horse you can go a lot of different directions with, which was my goal then. But I sort of fell into the specialization trap, got interested in that, did it for many years, and ironically, as I emerged from that end of things, I've been showing ranch riding. I'm back to having all sorts of different horses I'm tinkering with, buying horses off ranches. I've got a half draft mare. And you know, sometimes the circle just completes itself. And I'm back to trying to be a little more versatile now. As my career winds down, I'm sort of savoring the ability to experience some of that variety again. And I can't help but think that in today's world where things are so targeted, where we get obsessed and stay obsessed with one thing, maybe there's something lost. Maybe there's some completeness lost. Maybe there's something lost in terms of gaining a feel for the horse rather than the horse event. And I think that's a shame. Absolutely, the people who got into the reining focused only on the reining. It was hard for me to get past them. But when they had a problem, or when they couldn't load their horse, or when they got a horse that was unexpectedly unruly, I could help them, or at least would know how to help them and would know what was going wrong. A lot of times, some of those folks, as long as they were getting on a horse or even training up a horse to go do that discipline, they were solid. But when they stepped off that balance beam, they dropped. Now, there were a lot of really good horsemen in that field who could have turned any direction they wanted, but there were those who were limited by that narrow focus. And I never wanted to be there. And I think you lose something when you do focus that intently. You see a long, straight way, but you miss everything along the sides. Look around, smell the roses, sample all those horses. Try to do as many different things as you can, even if it's a little harder these days. And I think you'll find it rewarding, and I think as you go through your life with horses, all of those different experiences will start to add up and add up to something of real value. That's my speech talking about all the different crazy stuff I've done with horses. Shoot us a comment talking about all the stuff you've tried or all the stuff you'd like to try. Look forward to seeing it. Take care.